Rwanda tries to set the record straight. A Rwandan investigation implicates France in the slaughter of more than 800,000 ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus over the course of 100 days. But how far can it go to right the wrongs of the past? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmakers, France's role in Rwanda's genocide. Now, France was an indispensable collaborator in building the institutions that would become instruments of genocide. That's the finding of a damning report commissioned by the Rwandan government into the genocide that left at least 800,000, mostly Tutsis, dead in 1994. The investigation found that French officials had armed, trained, and protected the regime of former President Juvenal Habyarimana in the years leading up to Rwanda's genocide, and that despite increasing evidence that a genocide was foreseeable, France's support for its Rwandan allies was unwavering. The report says officials did so to protect France's own interests and its influence in Africa. But it added there's no evidence that French officials or personnel directly participated in the killing of Tutsis. Paris published the findings of its own inquiry in March and found the government bore serious and overwhelming responsibility and had been blinded by its colonial attitude toward Africa.
Mais l'essentiel que les deux commissions aboutissent à une conclusion.
The main thing is that the two commissions come to common conclusions, that France had a part to play, bears responsibility. On the one hand, this is a significant and overwhelming responsibility. On the other hand, France enabled a genocide which was foreseeable to take place and therefore bears obvious responsibilities.
D'avoir lieu. Et qu'il a donc des responsabilités évidentes.
Let's get straight to our panel now, and joining me from the Netherlands is Felix Ndahinda, an analyst and researcher focusing on transitional justice. And in London, we have Philip Clark, an international politics professor at SOAS University and the author of How Rwanda Judged Its Genocide. Thanks both so much for being with us. Both of you had picked up on the issue of semantics in these reports. There are very carefully chosen words in both of them, and complicity, for example, is never used. Still, Phil, I'll start with you. How damaging is this report for France? And more importantly, will there be repercussions for it?
I think this is a damning report for France. I think Rwanda, through this commissioned report, hasn't pulled its punches. That the report is very clear that France not only knew about crimes being committed during the Rwandan genocide, but also that it was directly involved in those crimes. But particularly the evidence that the French government supported, it trained, it armed the Interahamwe militias, which then carried out many massacres against Tutsi during the genocide. That kind of claim, that kind of evidence is extremely damning, and there will have to be some kind of French reply to that sort of accusation.
Okay, Felix, where do France and Rwanda then go from here now that these reports have been published?
I mean, it's hard to tell, especially since always politics tend to change, and much of this tends to depend on who is in office, especially on the French side. But that being said, I believe still there have been kind of an improvement in terms of documenting what happened. So you have the Rwanda report, the government of Rwanda report, you have the de Klerk report. I guess there is a pressing need to reconcile the content of the two documents, but also to reconcile the content of those two documents from previous reports. Keep in mind the fact that there have been, in '98, there was already a parliamentary report by the French parliament. And later, there were two reports by the Rwandan government, the Mutsinzi report and the Mucyo report. Now we have quite a number of reports with differing level of information, differing levels of methodologies used, and putting the data into all of these reports together and looking at where the truth sides is very important. And going forward, I guess there is a need to go deep into the conversation that has started with the publications.
Okay. Phil, if we can, let's look at the potential longer-term strategy here with this apparent reconciliation, if I can call it that. Is France now looking to build a relationship with President Kagame, possibly like the one it once had with Habyarimana?
I don't think we'll see as close a relationship between France and Rwanda as we saw between Mitterrand and Habyarimana, but there's no doubt that France is on a charm offensive with Rwanda at the moment. Macron is due to go to Kigali in the next couple of months, and one of the things that's been really interesting in the last week or so is that the Rwandan government's language towards France publicly has been quite careful. Even though this report is damning of France's involvement in the genocide against the Tutsi, the Rwandan government's language has actually been quite diplomatic, quite pragmatic. In many respects, they're allowing the report to speak for itself. In the past, we've often seen the Rwandan government make very loud, barbed accusations about French complicity. Well, that's not what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. And I think that also shows a willingness on the Rwandan government's part to try to forge a different type of diplomatic relationship with France.
Okay. Felix, I mean, do you see a longer-term strategy in this apparent reconciliation? And is it possible that Paul Kagame is feeling emboldened by this new potential relationship with France going forward?
I don't know whether I would use really the word emboldened, because we have to keep in mind the fact that this has been really a relationship which has had its ups and downs across the time. You know, if you look at even these two reports, you understand how this frosty a relation it has been. From the time when, for example, already France did court the RPF when it was still a guerrilla movement, when Kagame was in Paris in '91 and ended up being detained, for example, something that is very well documented, including within French media already from '97. He gave an interview on that. The visits, what happened during Sarkozy when the relationship a little bit improved, that was after the Brugère, for example, indictments. And now the warm up again with Macron. I guess Rwanda and Kagame, as you say, have been very much kind of, they have a long-term kind of reading of this frosty history, and they have been quite very pragmatic in the way they approach this. Even I can tell from his interview in '97, talking about the arrest in '91, he was very much pragmatic about looking forward and going past that, when he spent like 12 hours in the French cell while he had been invited by the French government. So that was him as an individual, as a representative of the RPF. Now he's in government, he's the head of state of Rwanda. I guess he has always looked after the genocide against the Tutsi at what are the interests of Rwanda, and how Rwanda as a small country has an interest in keeping a good relationship with France. That being said, they have been also very much aware of the fact that there is a very heavy legacy here that needs patience to unpack and to revisit progressively.
Right. Felix, let me stick with you, because for those who actually fear that Paul Kagame is becoming a dictator, I'll just put it bluntly, some of them suspect there is a risk here that with this reconciliation with France, that France could become an ally, a powerful ally that might allow Kagame to behave with greater impunity going forward. Do you see that risk?
I doubt whether the Rwandan president will change because of his relationship with France, and I think he has always made kind of a statement to that effect.
It's not so much change, it's just to continue this progression that some see towards dictatorship.
Again, it's a very interesting always take on Kagame dictatorship and those kind of lenses of looking at things. I guess those are claims that have been made already from, I think from the time that the RPF took over, already the terms used to refer to Kagame were the Kigali strongman, the vice president, but still strongman of Kigali. So much of what we said as newness in terms of this whole narrative around dictatorship, I guess it just from the time of the RPF and Kagame in particular as president, they have been always very much assertive in the way they control, they run business, and they take forward the agenda that they see fit for Rwanda and for regional or international cooperation. I doubt, again, whether their attitude will really change or be influenced by whatever their relationship with France is. Of course, having a good relationship with France matters in terms of whatever impediments may have in taking forward their agenda.
Okay. Phil, I can see you agreed with Felix there, but if I can move on with you, because I'd actually like to look back a little bit at why France did what it did, especially in arming and training troops and militia under Habyarimana. So protecting its sphere of influence in Africa was one reason cited, but why? Why is it so important for France to hear its language spoken? And in a country as small as Rwanda, and to counter Anglophone influence in Africa, why would that be important? And are those motivations actually still there?
I think it's one of the really remarkable things about France's post-colonial ideology or its post-colonial mentality is that long after it had ended officially its colonial activities, it still wanted this sphere of influence in different parts of Africa, including in places like Rwanda, where France had never been the colonial power. Rwanda, of course, was a Belgian colony. It shows that deep French desire to maintain influence right across the continent. And I think the second part of your question is the right one. We are now seeing France systematically re-engaging right across the African continent. We've seen it in the Sahel. We've seen it in Central African Republic, where France has a huge military presence. Alongside that, France has also embarked on a big diplomatic and economic push. And in many respects, Rwanda wants to be part of that. Rwanda, as a small landlocked country without many natural resources, is always on the lookout for new economic partners, for new diplomatic partners. They see a huge opportunity in this new French incursion into Africa. And I think that explains why we've seen very diplomatic language coming from Kagame and others towards France. That there's a big economic opportunity for Rwanda in France's new push.
It's interesting, Phil, because the report cited clearly that France had been blinded by its colonial attitude toward Africa. Is it something, in a sense, that's unique to France in colonial history, that it still is, some would even say, it's even today still obsessed a bit with its sphere of influence in colonial Africa, and that's why foreign interference, in a sense, is still happening on the African continent?
I think we see it from all of the previous colonial powers in Africa, but we maybe see it more strongly from France. There is, I think, culturally, this very deep sense of wanting to remain connected to parts of the continent that France almost considered its own. It's a deep part of the discourse in French politics and French society, wanting to make the most of those historical links. And I think what has gone along with that is a real lack of French acknowledgement of the extent of crimes committed during the colonial period and in places like Rwanda as recently as 1994. The French government, French society have never fully come to terms with the amount of damage that France has done right across the continent. And I think that that's the importance of this Rwandan report, is that it's a message to France in many respects to say it's time that you fully acknowledge what you did in Rwanda before, during, and after the genocide. It's time that you acknowledge that damage, and it's possibly time for a formal apology and a discussion about reparations. And I think there's a big push in some circles within Rwanda to take that conversation to that level, to say to France, it's not just enough to speak about these events, but we need to see some material action on the back of it.
Felix, do you agree there? And do you think enough has been learned? Or could the disaster, to put it mildly, we saw in Rwanda 27 years ago, could it potentially happen again? Perhaps not to the same extreme, but did that descent again into civil conflict?
You mean Rwanda?
Yes.
Or I guess, first of all, I agree with the fact that with what Phil was saying about the discussion. Indeed, a lot of Rwandan actors would want really to see France at a given time taking responsibility. I think it has, in the different reports, when you read the different French reports and even statements, be it by Sarkozy among others, you see that they are still agonizing with the language to let's say, capture that kind of level of involvement, blindness, overwhelming responsibility, and so on. As someone trained by a lawyer in the Francophone kind of legal systems, I'd be very much want to know how do you translate that in terms of asserting responsibility in the legal terms. And I think within the Rwandan kind of society, at least there is a lot of people who want to go beyond those words and think in juridical terms in putting that. And yes, I have written, for example, pieces around reparations, also debates being broadened to this. Now, in terms of talking about this happening again, we know scholars who like to always make those predictions, like from already the time the genocide ended. Others, there were people who are talking about, impeding genocide and so on. I guess in a region like that, where you have conflict, where you have a lot of actors involved, it's never too safe to say that atrocities would not happen. But at the same time, with the policies in place, fostering more what unites people than what divides them, regardless of whatever other criticism one may have about those politics, I believe that the chance of that happening to the magnitude of what happened in the past are very minimal.
Okay.
That would be what I strongly believe.
Okay. Phil, do you also believe those chances are very minimal, or are you seeing kind of the same conditions emerging now with the very long leadership term of Paul Kagame in Rwanda and the tensions that are still there in the region that were never properly entirely sorted out? Do you fear that the conditions that exist now could see another, I put it, a descent into chaos as we saw 27 years ago, or something, as Felix said, no, never that extreme again?
No, I think the situation in Rwanda has changed completely since 1994. In fact, I've just come back from Rwanda. I've been there doing fieldwork for the last 4 months. A lot of my fieldwork has been out in rural areas, including interviewing genocide perpetrators and genocide survivors from 1994. One of the things that strikes me is how much Rwanda has done to deal with the legacies of 1994 in terms of justice for genocide perpetrators, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of honesty at the local level about what actually happened during the genocide. I think that kind of work is absolutely vital to ensuring that Rwanda doesn't go back to that period of mass violence. Now, there are serious questions about what's happening at the national level in terms of national politics, the longevity of Kagame's rule, the state of the political opposition. All of those issues are there. But I don't think that at all equates to the violent situation that we saw in Rwanda in 1994, that the country in very important ways has really moved systematically on from that time.
Okay. And of course, France's role is not what it used to be entirely either. So the conditions are quite different.
The geopolitics of all of this has fundamentally changed as well. That's right.
Right. Okay, Phil, I'm going to have to give you the last word. So unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, 2 months ago, we discussed the trial of Hotel Rwanda hero Paul Rusesabagina at length. His trial had just gotten underway in Kigali, and some analysts argued that Rwanda's justice system should be trusted with his case, given its record of independence. But Rusesabagina did not agree and has since announced his refusal to participate in his own trial, where he's facing charges of terrorism. His 20 co-defendants are, however, present in court this week as more prosecution witnesses take the stand. Here now to talk about the trial and its implications is the daughter of Paul Rusesabagina, who's currently leading efforts to get her father released. Anais Kanimba, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you very much.
Good to have you. Let's start with what's happening now. Your father is not the only one being tried here, but he is the only one who's actually refused to attend. Was he hoping the other accused would also protest? And has his refusal actually made any difference to his case?
Well, so my father is, he was not expecting, and he's on his own, you know. This group case was added in October when the trial had already started, when the process had been on him at the beginning. And so when he made this decision, you know, was for himself. You know, specifically the Rwandan government and the justice system had denied him all his rights for defense. They didn't allow him to prepare his case. He had only seen his lawyer for 8 times. They were confiscating his documents. They didn't allow him to have his lawyers. So, you know, that concerns him. It does not concern the other co-accused. So when he made this decision, it was for himself and himself only. I remind you that the other co-accused were added on this trial, so they could be there to accuse him of this and to act like he's been working with them for I don't know how many years. And so when he made this decision, it was meant for him, and he did not expect that they would go on board. If they believe that they also are being trialed unfairly, they are free to do so as well. But he made this decision on his own, and again, because the justice system in Rwanda had denied him all his rights, the basic rights to create a defense. I don't know if you recall, but when he made that decision, the court wanted for him to learn the accusation as the accused and the co-accused go on trial, understand and witness against him. So this is why he said, I've tried. He was wanting to try to create a defense. He was wanting to play the game, for a lack of a better word, but the justice system denied him, and so he did not want to stay in court. And evidently, we see that him not being in the case, that hasn't changed anything. The verdict of this case was decided by President Kagame on September 5th when he made that first speech, and he's repeated that many times, so it hasn't changed.
It's unfortunate, though, that there are this many defendants, yet there can't be a sense of solidarity among them and your father. But let me ask you, you heard the first portion of our show today about the reports into the genocide and France's implications in it. I won't ask you to comment on those actual reports about potential French complicity in the Rwandan genocide, but I do want to get your thoughts on where you think the relationship with France might be going now, and if you think that that relationship could further empower President Kagame to throw human rights issues, as you feel those of your father, are being thrown under the bus.
I don't think I'm best placed to comment on the relationship between France and Rwanda right now. I would love to.
It's not so much about the relationship. It's about recognizing the legitimacy of Paul Kagame through another powerful ally, because he has been in power so long, and you feel he's a dictator.
Yes, he's a dictator, and France, by the fact that France is working with them, it's in the way of legitimizing this dictatorship, just as many other Western countries have legitimized this dictatorship. The fact that you're asking me about the independence of the judicial system, that's a way of legitimizing also this justice system that is independent, that it clearly we know that it's independent. It's not independent. I remind you, when this trial began, for instance, the justice minister was talking to the world on Al Jazeera, actually, saying that he had kidnapped my father. He was reading confiscated documents from my father between his lawyers and my father. So those are examples of injustice and of lack of independence, but yet many Westerners still don't see it. So, Kagame, a dictator, and many dictators have been empowered by many Westerners, and if France is leading toward that, it's really tragic. But again, I don't think I'm best placed to talk about this relationship with France and Rwanda.
Anais, it is remarkable. Some have noted that your father is actually now accused of almost exactly what former President Juvenal Habyarimana accused Paul Kagame of before he was killed. Do you fear at all that Rwanda is potentially returning to the same conditions present in the early 1990s? I'm not saying another genocide would occur. We actually established that earlier in the show. But do you see the same types of conditions arising? But now your father happens to be on the other side.
Well, in Rwanda, the way it has been, my father always says, the song stays the same, but the dancers change. What was happening before 1994, it was a Hutu regime with Habyarimana in power. They were abusing human rights. They were conducting many similar things as Kagame is doing today. Now it's just Kagame is in power and it's a different regime. But the type of things that they do are the same. So, where we are today, it's really scary. I would say scary in the sense that we see the kind of abuse of political abuse. We see the kind of human rights abuse that Habyarimana was doing. Kagame is actually even doing worse today, one would argue. And so, to your question, I think that it's really dangerous where our country is leading towards.
Quickly, Anais, you're in the United States. For years, you'd watched the U.S. celebrate your father. In hindsight, though, now, do you think that antagonized the government in Rwanda? I mean, in other words, had it not been for the publicity your father received, do you think he'd be on trial right now? And what else would you like the U.S. to do about his case?
Well, first of all, it's not the U.S. that made him only public, a platform. The entire world gave him a platform, and they gave him a platform because of his action during the genocide, when he saved more than 1,200 people in the genocide. We're very lucky in that my family's story was told in a Hollywood movie like Hotel Rwanda, and then my father wrote a book. And it's those two things that really made Kagame angry and jealous of him from the beginning. And, and so, yes, he had a platform in the United States, and he had a platform in Europe, and even in Africa as well. And so I'd like to correct that. It's not the United States that brought him there. It's Kagame's jealousy, Kagame's wanting to silence critics that brought him there. It's Kagame's dictatorship and his way of leading that brought him there. Okay. Today the United States is helping us in many ways. They have many congressmen, over 37 members of Congress, have written a letter to President Kagame demanding the release on humanitarian ground. And the State Department is also working on this, and many other people are working on this. All human rights organizations, not in the United States, but also in Belgium and in Europe and Africa as well, have also condemned this thing. So,
okay.
We want the United States to continue working on this and to continue supporting my family.
Okay.
But it's not because of the United States that he was there. It's because
Understood.
of Kagame. And I'd like to add one more thing, though. President Kagame chose to make his speech, the commemoration speech on April 7th, to speak in English and talk about how the United States is protecting people like my father, instead of talking about the people who died during the genocide, instead of talking about how we can move on in forgiveness. He chose to go and attack my father during his speech. So again, it's not the United States that brought him there, it's Kagame's hatred that brought him there.
Anais Kanimba, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We greatly appreciate it. And of course, to our viewers for tuning in as well. We'll see you next time.